Picture this. You are a powerful general in the year 1092. You command thousands of soldiers. Kings bow to your wisdom. Your enemies fear your name. Tonight, you sleep in the safest fortress in all of Persia, surrounded by guards who would die for you. But when morning comes, you do not wake up. On your pillow lies a single dagger, still warm from the hand that placed it there. No one heard a sound. No one saw a shadow. Your killer walked past 50 guards, entered your locked chamber, and vanished like smoke. This is not a story from a book. This really happened. Who were these silent killers that could make emperors tremble with fear? How did they move like ghosts through the strongest castles? Why did kings across 3 continents whisper their name in terror? Tonight, I want to take you on a journey back to the mountains of Persia, where a secret cult of assassins builds an empire of fear that would echo through history for nearly. You might think you know about assassins from movies or video games, but the real story is far more mysterious, more terrifying, and more beautiful than any fiction. These were not random killers. They were philosophers who believed that a single death could change the world. They were artists who painted with shadows and silence. They were believers who saw murder as a sacred act. And they were so good at what they did, their very name became the word we use for political killing even today. Some say they used a special drug called hashish that made them fearless. Others whisper that they could hypnotize men into obeying without question. Still others claim they built a secret paradise where they trained killers who thought they were already dead. But what if I told you that the most dangerous thing about them was not their blades, but their ideas? What if the real weapon was not poison or steel, but the simple knowledge that nowhere was truly safe? The story begins in the year 1090, in a time when the world was splitting apart. The Christian crusaders were marching toward Jerusalem, their armor gleaming in the desert sun. The Islamic world was torn between different groups who all claimed to follow the true path. In the middle of this chaos, when everyone was looking toward the Holy Land, a man named Hassan-i-Sabah was looking up at the mountains. Hassan was not like other men of his time. While others fought with armies, he fought with ideas. While others built their power on gold and land, he built his on loyalty and fear. He was a scholar who had studied the deepest mysteries of religion and politics. He had traveled from Egypt to Iraq, learning the secrets of different sects and schools of thought. But most importantly, he had learned something that other leaders had forgotten. He had learned that sometimes the right person dying at the right moment could change everything. High in the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia stood a fortress called Alamut. The name means eagle's nest, and when you see it, you understand why. Built on a rock peak that rises like a sword from the valley floor. It was impossible to attack and almost impossible to reach. For centuries, it had been the stronghold of local lords who used it to control the mountain passes. But Hassan saw something different when he looked at those walls. He saw the perfect place to build something the world had never seen before. The year was 1090 when Hassan and his followers took control of Alamut. They did not conquer it with an army. They did not buy it with gold. Instead, they did something much more clever. Hassan sent his agents to live in the villages around the castle. They became merchants, teachers, craftsmen. They helped their neighbors and earned their trust. They shared their beliefs quietly, carefully, like planting seeds in fertile soil. And when the time was right, when enough people in the area followed Hassan's ideas, the castle simply opened its gates to him. This was the first lesson of the Hashshashin. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from force, but from patience. Sometimes the strongest walls fall not to battering rams, but to the right words spoken to the right people at the right time. Hassan had learned that the human heart was easier to conquer than any fortress. From his mountain stronghold, Hassan began to build something that had never existed before. It was not quite an army, because soldiers fight in the open. It was not quite a school, because students study books instead of blades. It was not quite a religion, because priests pray instead of kill. What Hassan created was something new. Something that combined all these things into a weapon more dangerous than any sword. The men who came to serve Hassan were not ordinary soldiers. They were not hired killers who fought for gold. They were believers who had chosen to give their lives to an idea. They believed that the world was broken, that the wrong people held power, and that sometimes the only way to fix things was to remove the right person at the right moment. They called themselves the Nizari Ismailis, but their enemies had a different name for them. They called them the Hashshashin, the users of hashish, because they could not understand how men could be so fearless unless they were under the influence of drugs. But the truth was more complex than their enemies knew. Yes, some of Hassan's followers may have used hashish as part of their training, but their real drug was something far more powerful. Their real drug was purpose. Their real drug was the belief that what they were doing mattered, that their deaths would have meaning, that their sacrifice would change the world. And that kind of belief, that kind of certainty, can make a man capable of anything. Life inside Alamut was like nothing else in the medieval world. While other castles echoed with the sounds of feasting and fighting, Alamut was a place of quiet study and careful preparation. New recruits would spend years learning languages, studying the customs of different peoples, practicing the arts of disguise and deception. They learned to move silently, to climb walls like spiders, to kill quickly and quietly. But most importantly, they learned to wait. The training was not just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. Hassan and his teachers understood that to create the perfect assassin, you had to reshape the very soul of a man. They taught that death was not the end, but a doorway. They taught that the pleasures of this world were nothing compared to the paradise that awaited the faithful. They taught that to kill the right person at the right time was not murder, but justice. Some of the stories about their training sound like fairy tales. Western visitors claimed that Hassan had built a secret garden inside the castle, a place of flowing water and beautiful flowers, filled with lovely women and every pleasure imaginable. They said that recruits were given drugs and taken to this garden while unconscious, allowed to experience paradise for a few days, then drugged again and returned to the ordinary world. When they woke up, they were told that they had been given a preview of heaven, that they could return there permanently if they died carrying out Hassan's orders. Did this secret garden really exist? We may never know for certain. The stories come mostly from outsiders who never saw the inside of Alamut. But here is what we do know. Hassan's followers were absolutely convinced that death held no terror for them. They were absolutely certain that their cause was just, and they were absolutely willing to sacrifice their lives to achieve their goals. Whether this conviction came from drugs, from religious ecstasy, or from simple faith in their leader's vision, the result was the same. They became the most feared killers in the world. The first target was a man named Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire. Nizam was one of the most powerful men in the Islamic world, the advisor to sultans, the architect of an empire that stretched from Turkey to Afghanistan. He was also one of Hassan's most dangerous enemies. Nizam had spent years trying to crush the Ismaili sect, hunting down their leaders, destroying their communities. In Hassan's eyes, Nizam was not just a political opponent. He was an enemy of the true faith, a man whose death would serve both practical and spiritual purposes. The assassination happened in the year 1092, and it set the pattern for all that would follow. The killer was a man named Bu Tahir Arani, a follower of Hassan, who had spent months preparing for this moment. He did not attack Nizam in his palace, surrounded by guards. He did not try to poison his food or shoot him with arrows from a distance. Instead, he waited for the perfect moment, when Nizam was traveling between cities, when his guard was down. Tahir approached the vizier's litter, disguised as a holy man seeking charity. When Nizam leaned forward to give him coins, Tahir struck with a dagger, killing him instantly. What happened next was just as important as the killing itself. Tahir made no attempt to escape. He stood over his victim's body, calm and proud, waiting for the guards to cut him down. In those final moments, he declared his loyalty to Hassan and his joy at having completed his mission. He died with a smile on his face, convinced that he was about to enter paradise. This was the signature of the Hashshashin. They did not kill and run. They killed and stayed, accepting death as the price of their success. This was not just about eliminating enemies. It was about sending a message. It was about showing the world that Hassan's followers were not ordinary men, driven by ordinary fears. They were something new, something that could not be stopped by threats or torture or promises of wealth. The news of Nizam's death spread like wildfire across the Islamic world. Here was a man who had seemed untouchable, protected by armies and wealth and political power. Yet he had been killed by a single assassin who walked calmly to his death. If Nizam could die, then no one was safe. If the Hashshashin over the next century, the list of their victims read like a catalog of the most powerful men in the world. They killed caliphs and sultans, generals and governors, judges and scholars. They killed Christian crusaders and Muslim rulers with equal efficiency. They killed men who had wronged Hassan directly and men who had simply stood in the way of his vision for the world. Each assassination was a masterpiece of planning and execution. The Hashshashin would study their targets for months, learning their habits, their schedules, their weaknesses. They would infiltrate their households, sometimes spending years as trusted servants before striking. They would disguise themselves as merchants, scholars, even fellow nobles. They would wait for the perfect moment, the moment when their target was most vulnerable, most relaxed, most confident in his safety. Consider the assassination of Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader lords in the Holy Land. Raymond was a veteran warrior who had fought the Muslims for decades. He was surrounded by knights and men-at-arms, protected by the walls of his castle, defended by his reputation for vigilance and cunning. But in 1152, as he was walking through the streets of Tripoli, a man approached him, asking for directions. When Raymond leaned down to hear the question, the man struck with a hidden dagger. Raymond fell dead in the street, and his killer was cut down by the Count's bodyguards before he could take another step. Or think about the death of Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, in 1192. Conrad was one of the most paranoid rulers in the Crusader states, a man who trusted no one and went nowhere without a full escort. Yet two Hashshashin managed to gain his trust by posing as Christian monks. They served in his household for months, attending his prayers, eating at his table, earning his confidence. When the moment came, they struck him down in his own chambers, in the heart of his most secure fortress. What made these assassinations so terrifying was not just their success, but their impossibility. How could a peasant walk up to a count and kill him in broad daylight? How could enemy agents serve as trusted advisors for months without being discovered? How could killers penetrate the most secure locations in the world and escape without being caught? The answer was that they did not escape. They died gladly, believing that their deaths were as meaningful as their kills. This willingness to die changed everything. Most killers throughout history have been motivated by money, revenge, or political ambition. But men who are motivated by money want to live to spend it. Men who are motivated by revenge want to live to savor it. Men who are motivated by ambition want to live to enjoy their success. The Hashshashin were motivated by something else entirely. They were motivated by faith, by the absolute certainty that their cause was just and their reward was waiting in paradise. This made them almost impossible to stop. You cannot bribe a man who cares nothing for money. You cannot threaten a man who welcomes death. You cannot negotiate with a man who believes that compromise is betrayal. The usual tools of politics and warfare were useless against enemies who fought with such complete conviction. The fear spread far beyond the victims themselves. Every ruler in the region began to wonder if he was next. Every powerful man started looking over his shoulder, wondering if his trusted servants were really loyal, if his food was really safe, if his bedroom was really secure. The Hashshashin had weaponized paranoia itself. Stories began to spread, each one more frightening than the last. People whispered that the Hashshashin could change their appearance at will, that they could walk through walls, that they could make themselves invisible. They said that Hassan had agents in every court, spies in every household, killers hiding behind every friendly face. Some of these stories were true. Most were exaggerated, but all of them served Hassan's purpose perfectly. The most famous story involved Saladin, the great Kurdish general who united the Muslim world against the Crusaders. Saladin was one of the most powerful men of his age, a ruler who commanded armies across Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. But even Saladin was not immune to the fear of the Hashshashin. According to legend, he once woke up to find a dagger pinned to his pillow, along with a note warning him not to interfere with Hassan's followers. Whether this story is true or not, we know that Saladin was careful to maintain peaceful relations with Alamut for the rest of his life. This was the true genius of the Hashshashin. They understood that fear was more powerful than any army. They understood that the threat of death was often more effective than death itself. They understood that sometimes the most important victory was the one that happened in the enemy's mind, not on the battlefield. The word assassin itself comes from Hashshashin, and it entered European languages through the accounts of crusaders who returned home with stories of these mysterious killers. But the Europeans who told these stories did not really understand what they had encountered. They saw the Hashshashin as drug-crazed fanatics, as mindless killers who murdered for the pleasure of it. They missed the careful planning, the political strategy, the religious devotion that made the Hashshashin so effective. This misunderstanding was convenient for the It was easier to dismiss them as crazy killers than to acknowledge that they were skilled politicians who had found a new way to fight for power. It was easier to blame their success on drugs than to admit that they had outmaneuvered some of the greatest rulers of the age. It was easier to paint them as monsters than to confront the uncomfortable truth that they were men with sincere beliefs who had chosen a radical path to achieve their goals. The truth about the Hashshashin is more complex than either their enemies or their admirers would have you believe. They were not the superhuman killers of legend, capable of impossible feats of stealth and violence, but they were also not the mindless fanatics that their enemies described. They were something in between, something that the medieval world had never seen before and has rarely seen since. They were men who had found a way to turn their own deaths into weapons. They were believers who had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory comes from the willingness to lose everything. They were philosophers who had concluded that the world was so broken that it could only be fixed through the most extreme measures. They were artists who painted with blood and shadow, creating masterpieces of terror that would be remembered for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, they were human beings who had made a choice. They had looked at the world around them, seen injustice and corruption and suffering, and decided that something had to be done. The path they chose was dark and violent, but it was chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. They were not victims of circumstances or pawns of their leaders. They were men who had decided to take responsibility for changing the world, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. The stories that came out of Alamut were so strange, so frightening, that many people refused to believe them. How could a small group of men in a mountain fortress terrify the greatest empires of the world? How could assassins who numbered in the hundreds influence the actions of rulers who commanded tens of thousands? How could a sect that controlled only a few castles make kings and emperors change their policies? The answer lies in understanding what the Hashshashin had discovered about power itself. They had learned that power is not just about armies and gold and territory. Real power is about the ability to change people's behavior, to make them act the way you want them to act. And fear, they discovered, was one of the most effective tools for changing behavior that had ever been invented. Think about it this way. If you are a medieval ruler, you might have 100,000 soldiers in your army, but you are still just one man. You still have to sleep. You still have to eat. You still have to trust the people around you. And if you know that somewhere out there, patient and skilled killers are planning your death, if you know that any of your servants might be an enemy in disguise, if you know that any moment might be your last, then you start to behave differently. You become more careful, more paranoid, more willing to negotiate with your enemies instead of fighting them. This was the real weapon of the Hashshashin. Not the dagger, but the idea of the dagger. Not the poison, but the possibility of poison. Not the killer in the shadows, but the knowledge that there might be a killer in the shadows. They had learned to fight with fear itself, and fear was an enemy that could not be defeated with swords or arrows or siege engines. The psychological warfare was so effective that many rulers began to pay tribute to Hassan, not because they were conquered, but because they were afraid. They would send gold and gifts to Alamut, not out of friendship, but out of terror. They would change their policies, abandon their plans, alter their alliances, all to avoid becoming targets of the Hashshashin. In this way, a few hundred men in a mountain fortress were able to influence the behavior of empires. But the Hashshashin were not just random killers striking at whatever targets caught their fancy. They were strategic thinkers who understood that every assassination was a political act with consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate victim. They chose their targets carefully. When they killed Crusader leaders, they were not just striking at Christians. They were weakening the military coalition that threatened all Muslim lands. When they killed corrupt judges and governors, they were not just seeking personal revenge. They were trying to reform a system that they saw as fundamentally unjust. This is what made the Hashshashin so dangerous and so effective. They were not just killers. They were killers with a plan. They were not just fanatics. They were fanatics with a strategy. They were not just believers. They were believers who had found a way to turn their faith into a weapon that could change the world. The fear they inspired was so great that it began to take on a life of its own. Stories about the Hashshashin grew in the telling, becoming more elaborate and more frightening with each retelling. People began to credit them with powers they did not possess, to fear them for things they had never done. The line between reality and legend became blurred, and the Hashshashin found themselves fighting not just with steel and poison, but with myth and imagination. Some of the stories were clearly impossible. People claimed that the Hashshashin could make themselves invisible, that they could fly, that they could kill with a glance. Others were more plausible, but equally frightening. They said that Hassan had agents in every major city, that no secret was safe from his spies, that he could arrange for anyone to die anywhere, at any time. Some of these stories were true, others were exaggerated, but all of them served the same purpose. They made the Hashshashin seem more dangerous than they actually were. This was another lesson that the Hashshashin taught the world. Sometimes the most effective weapon is not the one you use, but the one people think you might use. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks you, but the one who might attack you. Sometimes the greatest victory is not the one you win on the battlefield, but the one you win in your enemy's imagination. The reputation of the Hashshashin grew so great that it began to influence events even when they were not directly involved. Rulers would blame them for deaths that they had not caused. Enemies would use their name to frighten rivals, and people would see their hand in every unexplained death or mysterious disappearance. The Hashshashin had become more than a military force or a religious sect. They had become a symbol, an idea, a shorthand for the fear that anyone, anywhere, at any time might be marked for death. But symbols are fragile things, and ideas can be destroyed as easily as they can be created. The Hashshashin had built their power on fear, but fear can turn against those who use it. They had made themselves seem invincible, but that only made their eventual defeat more shocking. They had convinced the world that they were immortal, but that only made their mortality more obvious when it finally came. The end began in the year 1256, when a Mongol army under Hulagu Khan appeared in the mountains of Persia. The Mongols were unlike any enemy the Hashshashin had faced before. They were not medieval rulers who could be frightened by assassinations or influenced by political pressure. They were nomadic warriors who had conquered half the world through simple, brutal efficiency. They did not fear death. They did not negotiate with enemies, and they did not leave problems unsolved. The Mongols had heard the stories about the Hashshashin, but they were not impressed. They had faced stranger enemies and deadlier foes. They had conquered civilizations older and more sophisticated than anything in Persia. They had destroyed cities and slaughtered populations without a second thought. A few hundred killers in a mountain fortress did not. Hulagu Khan sent a message to the current leader of the Hashshashin, a man named Ruknaldin Kursha. The message was simple and direct: surrender completely or be destroyed completely. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of compromise, no chance for the kind of political maneuvering that had served the Hashshashin so well against other enemies. Ruknaldin was not Hassani Sabah. He was not a visionary leader who could inspire men to die for an idea. He was not a strategic genius who could turn weakness into strength. He was a man who had inherited power without earning it, who had been born into leadership without learning how to lead. When faced with the choice between death and surrender, he chose surrender. The siege of Alamut lasted only a few weeks. The Mongols surrounded the castle, cut off all supply lines, and waited. They did not need to storm the walls or fight desperate battles. They simply made it clear that they would wait as long as necessary, that they would not be deterred by threats or impressed by reputation. When Ruknaldin finally opened the gates and surrendered, he was bringing to an end nearly 2 centuries of Hashshashin power. The Mongols were thorough in their destruction. They tore down the walls of Alamut stone by stone. They burned the libraries that contained the records of the Hashshashin. They killed the remaining members of the sect, including Ruknaldin himself. They wanted to make sure that the Hashshashin could never rise again, that their ideas would die with their bodies, that their legacy would be erased from history. But the Mongols, for all their military genius, did not understand the true nature of what they had destroyed. They had eliminated the Hashshashin as a political and military force, but they could not eliminate them as an idea. They had burned the books, but they could not burn the memories. They had killed the men, but they could not kill the stories that those men had inspired. The word assassin lived on, entering languages around the world as a testament to the fear that a small group of believers had once inspired. The stories of their impossible feats, their perfect disguises, their fearless deaths became part of the folklore of the Middle East and beyond. The idea that a few dedicated men could change the world through carefully planned violence became a template that other groups would follow for centuries to come. In our own time, the Hashshashin have found new life in popular culture. They have inspired novels and movies, video games, and television shows. They have become symbols of rebellion against authority, of the power of faith over fear, of the possibility that even the mightiest can be brought low by the determined few. The video game series Assassin's Creed has introduced millions of people to a fictionalized version of their story, turning them into heroes fighting for freedom against oppression. But these modern interpretations often miss the complexity of the original Hashshashin. They were not simple heroes or villains. They were men who had chosen to use extreme methods to achieve what they believed were righteous goals. They were philosophers who had concluded that sometimes murder was the only way to prevent greater suffering. They were believers who had decided that the world was so broken that it could only be fixed through the most radical measures. Were they right? That is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But whether you see them as heroes or villains, whether you admire their dedication or deplore their methods, you cannot deny that they changed the world. They introduced a new form of warfare, a new way of fighting for political change, a new understanding of the relationship between power and fear. They showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from strength, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything for an idea. The mountain fortress of Alamut is gone now, its stones scattered by centuries of wind and rain. The libraries are burned, the weapons are rusted, the men are dust. But the idea remains. The idea that anyone, anywhere, at any time might be marked for death. The idea that no power is so great that it cannot be challenged. The idea that sometimes the only way to change the world is to be willing to leave it. This is the true legacy of the Hashshashin. Not the murders they committed, or the terror they inspired, but the demonstration that human will, properly focused and completely committed, can overcome any obstacle. They showed that sometimes the greatest weapon is not the sword in your hand, but the idea in your head. They proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the army at your gates, but the man who is willing to die for his beliefs. In the end, the Hashshashin were destroyed not by their enemies, but by time itself. The world moved on. New powers arose. New methods of warfare were invented. The careful political assassination became less important as armies grew larger and weapons became more deadly. The personal touch of the knife in the dark was replaced by the impersonal destruction of cannons and guns. But for almost 200 years, a small group of believers in a mountain fortress held the world in fear. They showed that sometimes the few can challenge the many, that sometimes the weak can overcome the strong, that sometimes the outsiders can change the game completely. They proved that the most dangerous people in the world are not those who have nothing to lose, but those who have chosen to lose everything for something they believe in. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the lesson of the Hashshashin. Remember that every tyrant, no matter how powerful, is still just a man. Remember that every fortress, no matter how strong, can be penetrated by the right person at the right time. Remember that every idea, no matter how radical, can change the world if the right people are willing to die for it. The Hashshashin are gone, but their shadow remains. In every darkened doorway, in every whispered threat, in every moment when the powerful remember that they are not invincible, the spirit of Alamut lives on. They may have been killers, but they were also dreamers. They may have been fanatics, but they were also philosophers. They may have been destroyers, but they were also, in their own dark way, teachers. And the lesson they taught is this: that sometimes the greatest service you can do for the world is to show it that its certainties are illusions, its securities are false, and its powers are mortal. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is to whisper in the ear of the mighty that they too will die, that they too can be reached, that they too must answer for their actions. The dagger on the pillow is gone, but the idea remains. The whisper in the dark is silent, but the message echoes still. The Hashshashin have returned to dust, but their legacy lives on in every moment when the powerful remember that power is temporary, that life is fragile, and that somewhere in the shadows, someone might be watching, waiting, planning. Perhaps they were not killers at all, but teachers. Perhaps they were not destroyers, but creators. Perhaps they were not ending lives, but beginning ideas. Perhaps the most important thing they killed was not their enemies, but the illusion that anyone is truly safe, that any power is truly permanent, that any system is truly unchangeable. The mountain fortress is empty now, its chambers echoing with nothing but wind. But in the silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the whisper that once struck terror into the hearts of kings. You can still hear the question that they asked with every assassination, the challenge that they posed with every death. If we can reach him, Who is truly safe? If we can kill him, who is truly powerful? If we can change this, what else can be changed? These are the questions that the Hashshashin left behind, written not in books, but in blood, carved not in stone, but in memory. These are the whispers from the mountain of death, the final lesson of the secret cult of assassins. They remind us that the world is not as solid as it seems, that power is not as permanent as it appears, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not by those who live to enjoy them, but by those who die to achieve them. The story ends, but the idea continues. The men are gone, but the shadow remains. The Hashshashin have passed into legend, but legends, unlike men, can live forever. And in the darkness before dawn, when the powerful cannot sleep and the mighty fear to dream, the spirit of Alamut still walks the earth, still whispers its ancient promise that no one is untouchable, that no one is safe, and that somewhere in the shadows, the blade is always waiting. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where the Hashshashin once walked. Sleep peacefully, remembering that they chose their targets carefully and their causes thoughtfully. Sleep soundly, understanding that their war was not with the innocent, but with the corrupt, not with the weak, but with the tyrannical, not with the just, but with the unjust. But as you close your eyes tonight, carry with you the knowledge that they have left behind. The knowledge that power without justice is fragile, that strength without wisdom is temporary, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do in life is to show the world that some things are worth dying for. The Hashshashin are gone, but their questions remain. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind. Not the answers they provided, but the questions they forced us to ask. In the silence of the night, in the shadows of history, in the whispers of memory, the Hashshashin live on. Not as killers, not as fanatics, not as monsters, but as men who chose to ask the hardest questions and pay the highest prices for the answers. They were the secret cult of assassins, the whispers from the mountain of death, and their story is both ending and beginning, both conclusion and question, both death and immortality. The dagger may be sheathed, the fortress may be empty, and the men may be dust, but the idea remains sharp. The mountain still stands, and the whispers still echo through the centuries. This is their true victory, their lasting triumph, their eternal legacy. They have become more than men, more than killers, more than believers. They have become a question that each generation must answer for itself. What would you die for? What would you kill for? What would you sacrifice everything to change? The Hashshashin posed these questions with their lives and deaths, and they left them for us to answer. Their story is over, but ours continues. Their choices are made, but ours remain. Their whispers have faded, but the echoes grow stronger with each passing year. They were the secret cult of assassins, and their greatest assassination was not of any person, but of the comfortable lie that the world cannot be changed, that power cannot be challenged, that some things are simply the way they are and always will be. That lie died with their first victim, and it has never been resurrected. That may be the most important thing they ever killed, and the most valuable thing they ever gave us. In the end, perhaps that is what they really were. Not killers, but liberators. Not destroyers, but creators. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in the endless human struggle for justice, for truth, for the right to decide how the world should be. The secret cult of assassins has whispered their final words, and now the mountain of death falls silent. But somewhere in the darkness, someone is listening. Someone is learning. Someone is asking the same questions that once echoed through the halls of Alamut. And perhaps in that listening, in that learning, in that questioning, the Hashshashin have found their true immortality. The story ends here, but the legend continues. The men are gone, but the myth endures. The whispers fade, but the echoes grow stronger. This is how the Hashshashin achieved their greatest victory.